Seah growing up in a public housing estate, where people hold walks of life form a tapestry of cultures and communities, ignites Seah's passion for exploring the social impact of architecture. His interest in creative, cohesive community through architecture led to the design of the Singapore Sports Hub, an integrated sports, leisure, entertainment, and lifestyle hub. It won multiple awards, including Best Sports Building at the prestigious World Architecture Festival Awards in 2014, as well as Design Award at the 14th Singapore Institute of Architects. Seah encouraged public participation in the design process of social and community spaces. An example is our Pines Hub, where he and his team not only engaged the stakeholders, but also the Pines community in developing Singapore's first integrated community and lifestyle hub serving residents of the district. These developments won silver in London Design Awards and honorable mentions at Global Architecture and Design Award. Beyond high-profile projects, Seah championed several corporate social responsibility initiatives. A notable venture is Hardware Network's new headquarters, a space designed to reflect the non-profit organization missions of encouraging and empowering volunteerism in youth. Feeders by the URA, Urban Redevelopment Associations, in 2017 as one of the 20 under 45 Rising Architects, as well as Perspective 40 under 40 Design Leaders Architectures in 2014. Seah believes sustainable, green, and inclusive design is vital to the future of architecture, especially in land-scale Singapore. He also aims to elevate the local architectural provisions, its competitiveness and ethics as the president of the Singapore Institute of Architects, through deepening sustainable design capabilities, enterprising spirit, innovation-based collaboration and education. Please welcome on stage Seah.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Professor Xavier. Such a pleasure to be here in ESSEC Business School. Really such an honor to be addressing the crowd today. I was quite pleasantly surprised by the whole demographic of the group. I think this is the most amount of French community I've ever engaged in my life. A bit of interesting past and history. There's a bit of, I would say, connection with, of course, the French community. Earlier, Professor Xavier mentioned a project, the Singapore Sports Hub. So I spent 9 years of my youth, still young, on that project. So, and our client and our key partner was Dragage Bui, so which is a French group. And then that's also a place that's not just about creating a building that changed life, but it changed my own lives in terms of making new friends. And that's why it's quite special, I think, after a full circle, to be addressing a community that at least I'm quite familiar with. So salute to all. Key thing to start, I think this was the theme that was given as this year's Imagination Week. This idea of a world in transition from 2020 to 2050. So very specific number. And very important, Happy New Year to all of you, and also Happy Decade. So it's a very strategic moment in terms of this theme to allow us to really question. So I came into the room when I got the kind of invitation from Professor Xavier to say, okay, what can an architect kind of share and really contribute to a whole group of business students and future leaders in terms of this scene? And really, I have to go back to the core business of design. And then this is the proposed extension of the theme. It's really talking about the idea of a design for change. So obviously, the notion of transition, it already connotes the idea of change in place. And the idea of a design, it's really talking about the capacity to impact and influence. And but before that, I think important to set a bit of context. I gave them 2 cards earlier. So this is my day job, all right? I'm with DP Architects. For some of the friends here who may not be familiar with DP, so DP Architects is a homegrown, Singapore-grown, fully established more than 50 years. So just a little bit younger than my precious nation. So we are quite active globally. There's 16 offices worldwide, not in France yet, unfortunately, but quite near. We have an office in London, so not too far. Key thing, it's a multidisciplinary practice. It started from an architectural core and has expanded through the decades because we believe in total and holistic approach to design. And of course, we have a big team, 1,200 friends, part of the family. Key part, and it's interesting, it's also we have started to gravitate and move towards more of regional and global reach. So a firm of this size, and if you're talking about reach and influence, most of our project, close to 70%, is actually placed overseas. And then I've been with the firm for 16 years. It's quite scary. Sometimes you give this talk and you start counting. It's like, oh my God, 16. It's incredible. And key part, these are our 3 key strategic pillars about design first, people partner, and one global studio. So obviously, in terms of design philosophy that will help you to understand some of the works that I'll share later, it's a framework to allow us to look at design, where we talk about idea of drivers. You need leadership here. And then, of course, with that, data is key. And then with that, starts to generate discourse. And most importantly, how do you master the tool? Right? Of course, with that, we have measures in place to allow us to assess the impact of our projects office-wide. These are the people. I think it's important because behind every successful project, these are my partners. So we have 33 of us. And then these are the bigger family. So recent photo that we gathered together really to chart our way forward. I think important, as I said, is multidisciplinary. It really echoes and talk about the importance of collaboration, especially in this day and age when we talk about design and the power of design. And a whole series of expertise and typology, myself looking at sports and community, which I'll touch on again a little bit later. This is the footprint, but more importantly, the whole idea is to allow us to conceive from the notion of city all the way to the design of doorknobs and experience. This is what we aspire to achieve. And these are our preoccupation now, which is something I'll touch on a little bit. And then these are really also about a point in time for us to discuss about how do we look forward in terms of the few new decades to come, and quite relevant subjects to many. And digital part is quite key. This is, again, part of the foray by the office. But very important thing to us, as I was sharing with Xavier, it's not just about complex geometry, it's not just about the whole idea of programming, intelligence, but most important of all, it's really that part of human dimension, the delight that this method allows us to create work that actually brings joy to the users. All right. The other extension of me, SIA. I heard some of you have just landed in Singapore. This is not the airline, unfortunately. It's the Singapore Institute of Architects. All right. So key thing is I've also been with the institute as part of the advocate within the fraternity for coming to about 15 years. All right. So SIA in Singapore is the only representation of the architectural profession. So one of the major events that we hold for the city is its annual architecture festival. So it's an event for us to celebrate and talk about the city, talk about placemaking, talk about the community. So quite key. This again are my council and team members this year. And then very important part to us, it's talking about roles of architect. Again, the relevance of how do we communicate not just amongst ourselves, but with all of you. Whether you're in terms of business aspects or even just the man on the street, the idea and value that architects bring. So typically, people will associate architects, again, design, key, as the foundation, the part on technical skill set, the part on where we are agent to the state, talking about laws, public safety, public interest, and aspects of administration. But in SIA, we believe there are greater values where we deepen the conversation to discuss about economics. So architects, slightly different from, say, a cost consultant. We don't talk about just cost, dollars and cents. We like to discuss about values that we bring to the table in terms of design. So that's another level which is important. Environment, obviously, is quite key. The built environment or buildings itself attribute close to 11% of the embodied carbon All right, so this is a very important part, and social definitely is the basis of our action. But most important of all, and very key, and I would say that also it could be one aspect of this exchange that is very important, is actually the part on integration. Because we need to make sense of all this requirement from client's brief, their budget, the kind of codes, the laws, the compliance, and all this kind of ethos, and make sure that we create something that is legible, that's habitable, that's also something that people will find joy in kind of using the space. So this is one key aspect that is fundamental in terms of one of the roles and values that we bring in, and we believe is what we can co-champion with the community. One very important document that started the conversation coming to this theme of change or transformation is in fact this report of the Committee of Future Economy, something that came out 2016 that touches on all the 23 sectors of the economy, all right, to look at how we can remain competitive, relevant with all the impending challenges and issues that's rising. So this is interesting. So something maybe many of you or some of you will find useful. It's available online. I do think that it's quite, if you're interested, it'd be quite a good read to understand at least the kind of Singapore or national preoccupation, right? So obviously we use that as the vehicle for us to set the mission in terms of how SIA is looking at change. So we are talking about transformation by design 2.0 because this is our second term of the council. But more importantly, it's not just about the profession. It's in fact about the entire built environment, this whole kind of system that we are talking about. This is one of the way SIA is organized. Again, in key pillars of design, education, the whole idea of how we operate as a professional institution, and then of course the professional practice dimension. And the very key ethos that ties our action, again earlier Professor Xavier touched on a bit, the focus on sustainable and livability is key. It's not just about a beauty, there's purpose, and there's part about longevity and legacy. This aspect of profession that is evolving, constantly challenged by the change, not just in terms of society, but the idea of techniques and technology, how we are evolving and trying to share with the members to elevate, to look at enterprise. Idea of innovation and upskilling is key. You know, there's one aspect, I think as I shared, talking about regionalization and globalization, of how we internationalize our service, and that can only be through innovation and skill, all right? And of course, last part, it goes back to the human dimension. It needs to be about how we work with one another and about how we add to the community. And of course, one of the important, a very important conversation and common platform must be linked back to the larger kind of global discussion of the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And coming back to the theme, all right, so with that setting as the context and precedence, I have 200 slides, so I'm just going to run, all right, but I think important because it gives you a sense of, I thought what is actually quite important is this discussion of 2050, is to really use it as a basis for kind of discussion and the kind of conversation now. So the number somehow is quite phenomenal because if you Google, like many of our best friends, right, to start, this is already the kind of discussion that is taking place, the kind of visualization, the whole idea of how we are imagining our environment, the planet, to be in 2050. There's even a movie, there's a documentary by BBC. I think it talks about this scenario when in 2050, we are talking about the world population exploding to close to 9 billion people, all in one. And of course, the issues. And the part that I think when we talk about future, that's always associated with something that's flying. There's always talking about height, tall towers. And there's that kind of a picture that's always painted. And of course, Singapore is also part of the participation of how we imagine the whole idea of the city-state in 2050. This is by one of our local practitioner, very talented one, Woha. So this is also part of their kind of, I would say, participation, as I said, partaking in reimagining how the city can be like in terms of how it performs in energy, in terms of how it performs in the larger sustainable aspects of city making. And myself, in 2016, was part of the set design team, all right, that worked on a show for our National Day Parade within our stadium itself. So quite special. And that was looking at even further, 2065, because we just celebrate 50 years of our nation building, SG50, we call it in short. So this was really based on the theme of SG100, all right? And then, of course, the likes of that. But very important, this is just one of the clip to look at what the whole show is about. Okay, like I said, there's always things that's flying, right? And then it's really talking about the idea of how we collectively look at tomorrow's landscape. Of course, this is one part about how the city itself starts to float and rise from the ground and from the community itself. Okay. Just earlier, you were asking whether there's audio or music that comes with it. I say I'll probably provide that, but I'm not sure whether you want to really hear me sing, right? So this whole, and then what is very important is eventually how this city eventually becomes a huge tree that becomes the canopy that holds the community that is beneath this big tree. So this whole idea during that 2016 National Day Parade. But I mean, from that kind of excitement, we know that when we talk about future state, there's always another dimension to it. I think many of you may have watched the movie Interstellar. So, cool movie, incredible, but the message itself that is embedded, I think is really serious. All right, it's talking about alternative habitat where Earth itself is no longer habitable for human civilization. And of course, with that, we know other issues in terms of 2050, that there is major shift in the center in terms of economic powers. Based on IMF, within 2050, I think at least close to a quarter of Asian members will now be one of the powerhouse in terms of global GDP. So that center is shifting, so welcome to the new center of the world, all right? And then, of course, the part that comes with it is also the stress that in terms of this rapid development that we are subjecting Earth to. So in terms of massive urbanization, based on 2050 figures, it is quite scary. Close to, earlier I talked about 9 billion, close to, I would say more than 2/3 of the population, 7 billion, will be in urban setting, all right? And in terms of megacity, it's close to 445 city kind of creation in terms of population. That's equivalent to almost for each year from 2030 to 2050, every year, close to about 14 Singapore that is being developed, all right, all the way to 2050. That is the rate and intensity of urbanization. And of course, with that comes further toll to the kind of environment. And this is in terms of the natural resource. I thought this graphics is quite powerful in terms of depicting the deforestation in Amazon. The same waterfront, I think this was a bit of before, after. So the brown patch is areas that has been deforested, all right, from something green to that extent. And even based on the projected data, 2050, I think even earlier than that, we're saying 30, 1/4 of Amazon will be deforested. And then Amazon itself, you know, embrace part of the richest biodiversity, close to 400 billion, just tree species alone. So the kind of impact in terms of human behavior that's influencing the Earth in the years to come is major. Of course, comes with that is the heat that we are feeling, literally. All right, of course, in the Paris Agreement, we know that it's a target to meet. And I thought one of the very key message that probably some global leaders haven't got the message is, regardless of what we are doing, the temperature is going to rise. And the idea is if we fulfill our targets, minimally, it's about 3 degrees. That is scary. Because what is temperature to us? Just to give you a sense. When we talk about 1.5, I think their target by 2050 is to keep to about 1.5 degrees. we are talking about affecting 46 million people displaced by rising sea alone. So can you imagine when it hits 3 degrees, the kind of impact that it has in terms of the global kind of citizen is phenomenal. So very serious subject. But back home, we are also aware that there's a change in terms of the idea of the mix of demographic. I don't think it really applies to this group yet. So the idea is currently 1:8 Singaporeans are about 65 years old. In 2030, just 2030, it's 1:4. All right, so maybe if you add another 30 years, I think still there's a gap there. But it's real. And this is, again, a key conversation that we need to have in terms of the challenges with that graying population. Digital is key. And of course, when you talk about 2050, there's always the part on new intelligence. Beyond AI, the kind of communication, the whole notion of connection, human interaction. All right? But I think coming back to even present state, this whole idea of technology, the whole idea of hyper-connectivity, in fact, is already creating an issue. We are ever so connected, but yet not present. All right? So this whole idea of isolation, of alienation in relation to the advance in technology is already something quite real. And of course, worse still, there are figures, which say national leaders, that are talking about arcade method of further division and divide. So these are really serious issues in terms of context if I'm addressing to future global leaders that we are facing, all right? Besides that part of excitement and positivity. So a quote that I really like from one of the genius in terms of our realm, of a creator, Buckminster Fuller, talks about the whole idea of impact of design, in this case, through environment, where you start to shape behavior. I think in some sense, or rather in its true sense, Singapore is one of the best testament. Because as I think then our Deputy Prime Minister mentioned, we don't have any resource. Our key resource in Singapore is really human capital. And with that, part of the idea is to use ingenious and creative method to shape the right environment for us to further nurture and deepen the idea of building this capital, something quite key. And of course, in terms of my own personal process, this whole idea of starting from line, the imagination, to the built form, all right, of creating icons and landmarks. But most importantly, it's really about bringing people together. So the power of not just communities, sometimes in some case, the entire nation in one space, unified and in unison. That's something really powerful. And to some extent, the whole idea of architecture is this container of activities and daily life, something that is key, that allows the design to shape behavior, but at the same time, allow the users' behavior to start shaping the architecture or the environmental outcome. And thought in this case, it's good to probably share some of my works or the projects that we are doing in the office to relate to the idea of how do we harness capacity of design to really allow us to look into shaping the future. And 3 of the key, we'll say, impact in the capacity of design or the influence of design is probably at least these 3 aspects of synthesis, empowerment, and reimagination. Synthesis. So this is really talking about people and place, the whole idea of how 1 + 1 can be more than 2. And one of the imminent issues further aggravating some of our global conundrum is the idea of siloness. All right, and this happens everywhere. And I personally believe, and I think it is evident too, many of the issues, whether it's social, economic, environment, or our kind of issues of looking at digital transformation, a large part of the hindrance is because of the way we compartment the discussion, or we institutionalize each of these sectors. So the importance of cross-conversation is key, but I would say that there's an even greater impact when it starts to divide society, it starts to divide equity, and this becomes real issues that we are looking towards the future. And first project to touch on of how it is also a response. Earlier, Professor Xavier talked about Tampines. We are somewhere here, All right. So Tampines, just to give you a bit of background, is the first regional center of Singapore. All right. Singapore itself, we have a central zone, and there are 5 regional centers. It's the first to start. Right. Population is close to 250. I think currently should be about close to 260,000. Key space, and project itself, it's really this project called Our Tampines Hub. All right, Our Tampines Hub, in terms of quantum, is about 120,000 square meters. Just to give a sense, anybody knows Vivo City? Yeah, it is bigger than Vivo City. So if you imagine a community-centric space of that scale and magnitude, yeah, that's something at least to give you a sense. And of course, we completed the project. It started completing since 2016. Very interesting thing, of course, the siting is right within the town center of Tampines itself. That's the site, 5.4 hectares, Chee. Of course, with that, one of the most ambitious idea of this project is about bringing 12 government agencies all under one roof. This whole idea of a whole experimentation in terms of idea of social service kind of construct. And this is also a part that every time I talk about it brings some kind of pride and also a little bit of the kind of pain. Is that in Singapore, when we want to start something, wow, we really start with one of the biggest and most ambitious. So if you have dealt with government agencies, you know that dealing with one can be already quite delightful. I've used the right word. So when you put 12 together, it's quite crazy. So I always use this analogy. It's like 12 siblings, or for some guys, it's like 12 wives at the same time. It's quite mad. Or for the ladies, 12 husbands. All right, have to be fair. But it's also a very important point where conversations of this nature, where we look at social infrastructure, the whole evolution and development start taking place. Idea of community center in Singapore started in the early 60s. And interestingly, when we did the research, it was primarily a center, and the feature within this center is a color TV. So most people can't afford color TV, so everybody gathers, and from there, some of the key interaction happens. And across the years, yes, evolved to absorb various components. Some F&B, idea of library started to take place. So this whole idea of bringing 12 agencies, typically quite formed in their kind of process and thinking. What kind of potential can it bring? There's also the discussion of the idea of community, that the idea of center no longer is the key kind of interest or facilities that one go for, but a whole diverse program that draws and brings the community together. So the idea of Our Tampines Hub, in short, we call it OTH. It's really, in big aspiration is the whole idea of how it's something designed for, by, and with the community of Tampines. So obviously, it started taking key kind of identities and characters of the building, coupled with a lot of residents' participation to collectively create this idea of integrated hubs. So this is the grand opening, brought all the residents together. So usually, the idea is VIP, you invite, say, ministers, some of the politicians, but this is where the residents become. So there is already a very intentional way to shift away from the whole idea of how we start creating a community space of this nature. And of course, there's a whole host of engagement, very intense. You went through 1 year of very intensive engagement, from roadshow, you see typically, say, in some of the such events, all the way to block parties. Block parties, you know, we stay in public housing, is by per block, to even floor parties. It goes by per floor. So very, very fine grain. And of course, there's interest group, focus group, social media websites, form of engagement. This is really showing the evolution of how, in the end, eventually the hub was conceived. It's interesting, when it first started, the project was about 4-story. I give a sense of density. But after various engagement, it started, I think, with 7 agencies. Everybody wants to come together. So it just kept building. And of course, we shared about how it operates not just as a site, but understanding the whole entire network. It has a main space, all right? One of the key focus is how it talks to the town, it's on porosity. This whole idea of open ground floor or areas on ground given priorities to social or community program. Because when 12 agencies come together, it was quite difficult. You know, everyone wants ground floor entrance, right? Naturally. All right, when you have 6 stories, they say, no, I want first story. So in the end, none of them got ground floor. Yeah, most of them got second, and then we work based on the community's kind of focus angle. So the idea of ground is only for social program or primarily for community. There's some retail, but in terms of retail footprint, is about 15% of the overall floor plate. So that itself has already shifted from the typical idea of maximize the kind of commercial interest and frontage. And interestingly, I think this is also a kind of human behavior. In several of the engagement, many of the residents in Tampines shared, can we not see another shopping mall? Because actually Tampines Regional Center, if you visit the place, it has a lot of malls. So their first instinct, they know this is big, they say that, hey, we want something quite different. Right, the whole idea of big space versus something intimate, idea of flexible usage. So the first event was actually, so the whole idea of square is actually part of the FIFA 2-star football pitch. They have massive yoga. Of course, they have clubs. They even have concert, the first concert out of a city center within the heartland. Idea of how it works as part of the city, very important in conception. Again, how it works, it brings the street into play. There is a main street that connects the downtown center to the central park within Tampines. So this is the street that we create, sheltered but naturally ventilated. If you have a chance to visit, again, through kind of different digital means, we are able to simulate and make sure that this environment is conducive, even without aircon, right? So the idea that it captures various movement and in fact segments of life is something we thought is quite powerful. And this whole idea of movement is multiplied 3-dimensionally as a whole array of network throughout the entire site of link bridges, of connectivity that strings the various programs together, all right into a plaza space in the center. It's a combination of various diverse programs. There's civic, cultural, arts, there's community, sports, Chee. So within the site, this is really the whole idea of creating not just a place, but a place of many places, right? And these are the whole host of programs right under that. And in spatial form, this is the kind of environment that we need to create quite bespoke to each of the segment or the user group. But very importantly, the whole idea is not just look at them in isolation. In design strategy, we move away from the typical stacking of floors and look at 3-dimensional clustering of facilities so that we maximize dialogue to say that even in this room, I'm quite aware of what's happening next door. So what we believe is by maximizing spectatorship, you also encourage participation. So the whole expression describes this 3-dimensional dialogue. And spatial way, as I said, you're constantly aware of what's happening in the other spaces. This is also quite key. When projects come to a certain scale in architecture, idea of program or the use becomes critical. So one of the key design is really design how the use relate to one another. These are the 12 agencies, and these are all the facilities that they have located. So typically, each agency will say, I want my space this way, that way, that way. So we did the first exercise. We covered all their names. And then with that, we started to cluster what makes sense to you and me, not to the agencies, to users. And then start to regroup them, look at different areas of where they can share, quite complex mapping. So I'm just trying to simplify it, but it's still quite complex. So the whole idea of various spaces that we're creating, this is the idea where we brought cooking right into the library, all right? Because we think that you can get your recipe outside, well, but this is actually a space that doesn't belong to the library stakeholders. So this whole idea of synergy that is taking place, bring green. So again, a whole assemblage of this idea of environmental system, the users of spaces, rooftop jogging track, rooftop pool, and then, but very importantly, through this integration, it also allows us to harness the system as a closed loop, where the solar energy from rooftop can be used for the basement car park, and the food waste is converted to fertilizer that we can use for the community farm. So hawker center, key space, so some of the simulation, so quite a fair bit of technology is embedded. So not just in terms of the design, but also the operation, where we talk about food waste converting to fertilizers. So all within that space. So the whole idea of once that purpose is set in place, all the kind of support in terms of technology starts to make sense, right? So in terms of various manpower, lean or productive method, robotics, and even in terms of performance-based, where behaviors are analyzed and help in terms of further data. Key thing, it's really going back to the people. The whole idea of not just physical gathering, social media, the cool part is it has a lot of participation. And one of the most encouraging things since its opening is that each year, I think last year, it saw 18 million footfall. So in Singapore, 18 million to a community space is like equivalent to an airport. So the kind of participation there is really kind of quite incredible. And very, very interestingly, say originally based on usual statistic, this is in most of our community spaces based on data, the minority race, like our Malay community and Indian community is very low, 2%, 7%. But here in OTH, it went up to close to combined more than 40%. So it's starting to change behavior. So this is where we talk about that synergy of 1 + 1 can really become more than 2. And the latest, it was quite funny. So we talk about the concert. We even have the army boys, first time, not within the camp, but they came out of the camp to the community for the passing out. And then, of course, Ronaldo was here, but he only had 300 fans. So this is the man, Ip Man, if you watch the movie. He drew 5,000 crowd. The whole space was packed. So the whole kind of diverse inclusion of activity is really what this whole idea of infrastructure supports. And really, this is one of the key ministers that's behind this project. He says that the project itself really starts when the building completes. And then, of course, as an extension of synthesis, there's a part on another hub that we are doing. We talk about the issue of deforestation. And in Sembawang, a hub of a totally different nature is also in the planning. This is within 11.7 hectare site of an existing park. So we are told to look at an integrated hub too. But in this case, we have to only allow, or we can only build it up to 2.5 story height. So the idea of respecting the topography of the hill and the existing tree. And within the building, there is also a national monument that used to be the House of the Emerald during the British colonial days, that has a vantage view towards the naval base. Quite incredible project. So again, it allows us to start to question, all right, the potential of how we look towards the future, all right, with the knowledge of the past, the current, really how it allows us to start discussing about what could be, and bigger subjects of divide of what's green and what's hard or the city. And of course, this is the result of the kind of imagination of, it's called Bukit Canberra. Idea is really creating, again, core idea of not just vibrancy, but accessibility, while in keeping this whole idea of a park setting. I would say major paradigm shift is where you take building and then you put it down and start planting all around it. In this case, you start with the green, you plant the building around the green. So this is the site looking at its larger impact in terms of the larger green network. And of course, within that, program is key. 4 key programs. Green, it's already the basis, the asset. Idea of bringing water, health, and food. So idea of a program, creating various clusters, again, not by agencies, by more of use and nature. So there's hawker center, the idea of a pool, the notion of even a polyclinic, a healthcare center for seniors, and the idea of even farming and outdoor, all right? So the idea of creating networks, not just for human enjoyment, but even for butterflies, all right? So this was the task of us trying to retain the trees that within the site. And then, of course, the building footprint itself, all 100% green replacement. So whatever land we take, we replace with green. And then water, and very important, replanting. So we are replanting 1,600 trees back to the site, further intensifying that kind of green. And of course, with that, key thing related to this, it's really the whole kind of setting that we create for the community, but also the larger biodiversity that it starts to generate. So the idea of each of the layers and stratas, and then not just where the site doesn't have buildings, so the building itself also becomes the infrastructure for all these different species to continue to grow and kind of evolve. So geometry-wise, we took on something quite different. The idea notion of hexagon, which is also a geometry from nature, actually works well for more interaction. Exactly like this hall. This is me and you, but when we create a spatial setting that is different, you create multiple interfaces for dialogues, right? So this is the building in place. Hopefully it will turn out like that, right? So one of the key gathering space, important thing is also in design to push for new technology. This probably in France, it's common, but in Singapore, this is the first few timber building. Here we call mass engineered timber. Of course, construction ongoing, something quite cool. Itself, I think in materiality, in terms of its energy consumption, greenhouse emission, pollution, it's one of the most sustainable source. So itself, it's also this foray for us to go into the discourse of what's the kind of right building material to cultivate the kind of value to the community. And technology has already proven that towers can be built with timber too. So not sure next time when you visit Singapore, you'll see a timber tower. Of course, biodiversity is key. This is really the ambition. This is during the competition what we put. Year zero, we create a building, but create the infrastructure for the greenery to start creeping in. And then of course with that, right? And then really coming back to the community. Empowerment, key. It's really about people. Coming down to the scale of it, and this is looking down, not just about generalizing, just talking about segment O, but specific segment of elderlies. Somewhere a very small center within one of our typical public housing setting up, what we call a void deck. So block 52, this is a very small, we'll call senior center. Idea located within a mature estate, really addressing one of the marginalized group of the seniors, which is the stay-alone elderly. Many of you are probably aware, I think this is a very vulnerable group, and then in terms of seniors on their own, I think based on data coming to 2030 even, there's close to about 1 million of the seniors in Singapore that are on their own. And then of course there's the sad case of suicide and issues of them kind of passing on at home. Key thing was also questioning a social welfare kind of method, where many of these seniors, there's good intent. They bring food to their house, all right, they give them pamphlet. But the issue is then they don't even need to step out of their house. This is where design, we need to look deep into the subject, all right, of what the whole concept actually address. So this is the space. Idea is really true, very important, the agency of food. So something I hope you enjoy in Singapore too. All right, bringing the community together. It's really true that to shift the perception or the role of these elderlies from object of charity to stakeholders and leaders. So here, they are not just given food. They are the one who prepared the food for one another. So you're instilling a role in terms of just the design of a simple center. So in design, porosity is key. In the center, that's where we place the kitchen, where all the activities revolve around. And then the whole idea that, you know, most of the centers, I'm not sure in France, how is it like? It's either glassed or gated. So it's a bit like fish tank, you know, but a different context, fish tank has different connotation. So the idea that, okay, we wanted to break this idea of definition of threshold, and the design inject a whole series of doors as the very facade. So the facade is designed as an array of doors that's all open, and it creates this notion of porosity right through. And this is where the common area and the specific area are. So this is where you start to blur boundaries and you dissolve stigma. Otherwise, you'll say, hey, this chap going in, maybe they will need some help. So the idea of how we blur the boundary is key. notion of colors is important because for seniors, some of them have slight dementia, and it becomes a universal language to say that if you want to prepare food, go to the red zone. Okay, this is where you do washing. And we design a whole array of infographics to help, and then really looking at how this creates the space. Yeah, if you're interested, you can always visit it too. All right, so how we communicate. And this is always a story I love to tell about Uncle Louis. So because when we first conceived the idea with the client, this social welfare group called Montfort Care, they went to Uncle Louis and said, not that you're Uncle Louis, all right? Say, Uncle Louis, Uncle Louis, come down, let us help you. So his first, of course, natural answer was, no, I do not need your help. So after the design idea further germinates and progress into this stage, they went back to Uncle Louis and asked him, Uncle Louis, can you come down and help us? He said, yes, I'll do that. So the power of design in kind of instilling ownership, the whole idea of leadership, and the whole idea of dignity is fundamental. So cool part about it is I'm currently working on the version 2 of Good Life, all right? And something fun, just a snippet, is looking beyond the center of really how you address as community support of even the whole idea of the future aging in place. Because a part of many of the seniors is they will go to nursing home, but part of our thesis or hypothesis is that if the community has enough of such community support, you can even create a robust kind of support system that many of them can age in place, right? That I hope next time you'll share. Another group from old to young, this is what, again, Professor Xavier talked about, is with a youth charity that we're working on. Again, in this old space center, this youth charity, quite cool, it reached out to close to 1,500 youths annually. So we went to see their building, not as beautiful as your campus. All right, many of you, if you come to this space as youth volunteer, you will know what's your first reaction. It's like, yeah. So, but coming back to existing building, this is a commercial building by our Housing Development Board. They gave them a unit. So we went in to see, and then this is the space that we had. So we thought, use the whole idea of concept of building blocks, something we can talk about, develop a system, look at how it creates a whole palette for the users to start shaping their own environment. Again, empowerment through design, a whole array of language, ties with their values and kind of principle to create a whole new environment for the spaces. So the foyer space, coming back to so-called their training room. So in the brief, it's a training room. We say, why don't you create a big gathering space that you can close up and allow participation to take place. So the idea of all these modules sets the basic framework of the entire space, a lot of walls for kind of dialogues. So this are actually sound absorber for acoustic, but we did them as origami that kind of carries their kind of idea of logos and principles. Space, so idea of green, each of the youth volunteers are supposed to adopt a plant. All right, again, the whole idea is through a space you cultivate a behavior, and then you teach them and impart them values of life. And then part of the system, because the budget was real low, but we could still innovate to take aircon condensate and collect the water to water the plants. Of course, part of the thing we worked with a partner, ABB, that allows us to also digitalize all the various systems for them to track real-time their own consumption of energy, right? So space itself, the kind of setting, and then really the community coming together. Last project, all right? Okay, so in terms of reimagination, I think this idea of, it's one of the smallest projects here. It's at Jurong East, the western end, and this is what we call Project BS, all right? Not that BS that you know, it's Project Bus Stop, all right? Important, I think a key idea, it's really looking at, in terms of future discussion of mobility, quite scary. Based on data, coming back to our idea of 2050, in India alone, daily, they are constructing 40 kilometers square of road daily. 40 kilometers square. So by 2050, I saw one number, more than 3,000% of road for vehicles. So this is real, as we talk about evolution of technology, transportation. So the whole idea that, again, part of the studies here was this very interesting scenario, I think, in Nigeria, where that kind of close contact with human and this machine of transportation becomes something we thought. And even when you talk about conception of future, the idea of man and machine in terms of movement, mobility, is always close in discussion, all right? And this is where we really look at how community or social participation can be a part to really change the way we understand transport infrastructure. So it's a project by some of these key partners that we work with, Project Bus Stop. It's actually the idea of BS was also about blind spot, all right? That things we take for granted daily. So sometimes this is an avenue that we thought by shifting certain perception, you can change behavior again. It was a whole array of exercise that I did with some students. I said, okay, let's test bed. What are all the things that we can do in terms of future transport? Idea of adding libraries to it, allow it to install on site, converting it to gallery, and then maybe even do game shows, all right, where they share stories. And with the agency, they gave us a site of looking at a bus stop. So the idea of whatever happens, one thing will never change, even at Grab, all right? We talk about future transport, the notion of time is critical. So to us, main exercise was how can we make that part of waiting, which is something that can be quite excruciating, to something that could be quite delightful. So very simple exercise, and this is looking at impact. So daily, close to 4 million Singaporeans travel on the buses alone. So this is, I think that now the figure is close to 4 million. Yes, it's already exceed 4 million. All right, that is our target users. And in terms of sites, we have closed more than 4,500 bus stops. So this is our whole concept of site, not just that very bus stop we are looking. So this is a site, this is all the bus stops around Singapore. And this was originally what the bus stop was. And so the whole idea, again, in terms of the reimagination, is taking this, actually introducing various components and recreating this as a kind of a social landscape. So you inject social dimension into something that typically you see it as a tool, all right? So of course, the things that comes with it. So this was a prototype project that they tested for a year. So unfortunately, if you go there now, you can't see the bus stop, right? So it's about looking at kit of parts, how we attach various components, test bedding it, okay, and allows. So, but what is quite key is it allows you to create your own kind of bus stop. Say if you're in a park, you can bring trees, rooftop garden, to something all the way to something a lot more media focused. So this kit of parts allows the community or the residents near the area or the district to really partake in the shaping of it. So this was solar cells, and there's Green-Fi, solar-powered Wi-Fi that we're test bedding. Idea that there's also a mural done by local artists to tell the story of the site. So there's, of course, real-time intelligence in terms of bus movement. We even bring library to allow sharing. But there's also e-books within that. So there's a physical experience coupled with the kind of a digital enhancement of that enjoyment. So these are the various kit of parts. So of course, this was, I think, 16. Phone was still charging that way, all right? But that was the idea, right? So you could see the various users working with it. So of course, looking at universal access. And what is quite delightful is it started a whole conversation, not just locally, but even globally, about the importance of looking at bus stops as extension of your social spaces. And then, of course, the swing. And really, this is a summary of what I shared in terms of really of harnessing the capacity of design in looking at synthesizing all the various dynamics, looking at the way that it allows us to reimagine our setting, but most important, going back to the human and social capital of and empowering the users. And oh, there's supposed to be yeah, all right, of the various spaces we talk about. And what is actually quite key is beyond each of the project, say after our Tampines Town Hub is done, it started kind of driving the emergence of various integrated hubs in the landscape of Singapore. So the project itself, in terms of impact, can be much greater than its own. All right, and in terms of bus stop, there were various kind of discussion. Other versions of bus stops started to appear. Even buses started to emerge. And then within the idea of void deck public housing centers, after Good Life Makan, a whole array of this different community-based support networks started, right? And then, I mean, coming back to this whole idea of future setting, it's really understanding not just the past, the present, in order for us to purposefully chart our path towards the future. And I thought of closing with this project in terms of the NDP, where we talk about that kind of dream, ultimately anchored by a symbol of sustainability, grounded back based on human values. And for some of the friends that are probably not aware, the whole NDP show was inspired by a letter. So earlier I started with a quote by Mr. Fuller. This is again by a very distinguished figure here in Singapore, Professor Tommy Koh, who had this letter that he wrote to his grandchildren in the year 2065. He talks about, again, what is key in terms of us looking towards the future. These are, I would say, the 8 big thoughts that he said. Love your country, so love France. All right, so love the world, love your family, make friends, something important for life. Don't worship money. Idea of kindness, loyalty, and most important, be healthy and culturally rich. And then really, I think with that, this whole idea of looking at the world from now to 2050, it's really, I hope, through this sharing, it looks at how in our own, whether individual or group capacity, we look at changing or shaping the world purposefully, really towards a better tomorrow. Okay, with that, thank you so much. Sorry, did I take too much time?
No, that's perfect.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Seah. That was an amazing talk about your own journey and how it transformed Singapore. And I also learned about many things as well in terms of topics. Any question to start? Yes.
Wow, so fast.
Hello.
Hi.
What is the most key or most important concept that you would use in the design stages of every social infrastructure project?
Okay, thank you. It's a good question. In fact, that is the answer. If you look at each of the project, I think something that I probably didn't stress on too much earlier is we always start off with a question. That is one of the, I would say, the key to, at least in design process, we touch on. Collectively, we'll identify the most important question to ask. Because what is worse than finding best solution is that it's actually addressing a wrong answer or a wrong question to start. So, and this idea of looking at question really requires us to look at not just about what, say, the users or community wants, but really what do they need. So it takes a bit of courage, it takes creativity, but a very key process of how we approach each and every project. Yes.
Thanks for your presentation. And I read one sentence from your personal page. You wrote, architecture in form, material, and space reflects core aspects of our value system. So I really like this sentence. And would you like to describe the core value of Singapore value system and how you expect this to evolve like until 2050 and how will it affect the architecture by then?
Okay, wow. So actually I was calculating by 2050, I'm like 70 plus. I was like, oh my God. So, but and honestly, I don't think anyone probably has the ability to look that far, all right, towards the future. But wanted to talk about the main sentence of at least personally to me, the role, or rather the whole idea of architecture is really this extension of value system. Because the way we design, we shape the environment, the kind of spaces we put, the priority, say, we put towards commercial versus social, private versus public, the whole idea of the kind of material that we use, as I mentioned, concrete versus steel versus timber. All right, these are all extension of the value that, in this case, us as designer together with our client placed for the project to be shared and used by the society or the community. So this is where it's important. And also a very big message here. Earlier, I also had a chat with Xavier. You see, the whole idea of projecting towards the future, technology will continue to change. We know that just more than 10 years ago, the moment iPhone was introduced to our life, almost every one of us, I use the word almost, all right, cannot live away from your device, all right? It shapes the way we interact, it shapes the way we receive or seek for information. And you know that you will continue to shape, but very important, something that's very fundamental, again linking back to the slide that I shared about Professor Tommy Koh's letter. It's really the value that will allow us to stay human. Because I think there's no point for us to pursue to become second-class robots when we should focus to become first-class human. So this is really talking about maybe in this role as an architect, how do I kind of propagate such belief and such conviction?
Hello, thanks a lot for your presentation. I was wondering about the future of residence for senior citizens. You talk about that, the fact that in some countries people are more old. Do you have concrete examples of how you can implement innovations, new technologies, that examples that will be in fact in our life in 2050?
Okay, thank you for that. I use the idea of good life makan as something key. Actually, I share quite personally. The project, how I chanced upon it was quite accidental. I always like to tell this story because it's moments like that that change your life. So I got a call from one of my secondary school art teacher's daughter that used to work with this social welfare group. So her name is Ruth. So Ruth called and said, "Hey, Chee Huang, my mom said you're an architect." I said, "Yes, I'm still an architect at that point of time. Yeah, can you help me with one project?" Not knowing what it was, I said, "Sure, all right." And then I chanced upon Good Life Makan. And really through this project, it allows me to develop further insights into the whole idea of aging. You see, there is this part about us, conveniently, we like to group various segments or I would say groups of our community, say, okay, this is old, this is young, that is young children. But within that, there's actually finer grain. So the first thing of looking at aging is to understand the various facets of it. And in this case, it was this specific group that, again, relating back to the idea of blind spot, that's sometimes fallen out of most of our view. So one of the very key things of Good Life Makan was, in fact, deliberately to place significance and importance. And it was the client's request to make sure that the center is full of colors. He said, I want to debunk this idea that aging is about natural, material, something that is not exciting. He said he wants to change that perception. So that's something important to start. As I said, the whole idea of the project is to shift our role of looking at it. So because once you start understanding and look at things differently, questioning it deeply, then we start to look at the needs. Idea of good life that is exciting, I share about this idea of version 2, 2.0, or even actually we are talking about 4.0, is that the power of this client is that they have been in this neighborhood there for more than close to 2 decades. So actually they know each of the neighborhood, all their seniors very well. So with the idea of this center as one of the node, what they are doing now is quite cool. They have within their center nurses that actually provide daily consultation or assistance to residents there. So once you start off through a place to allow these services to happen, our belief is that this eventually, when it starts to integrate vertically with the public housing, could be an alternative response to aging in place. There is a part in Singapore where we talk about aging. When you are more helpless on your own, you get sent to places like nursing center or nursing home. And in most culture and contexts, that's definitely not the most pleasant place that you want to spend the last years of your life in. So we wanted to use Good Life as a prototype to further test bed of how a strong community-based or ground-up support can start to support a specific segment. So that's something that we're venturing into, because once we have that, then it's to identify the right technology, whether it's about sensor, about location, especially those that are suffering from dementia, to allow them to roam within the whole neighborhood in places that's familiar for them. All right, and we think that this itself actually creates a greater wellness and well-being for many of these seniors, rather to isolate them from an environment that they have spent decades of their life and put them in a place that will be really sad for like I said, the last years of their life. Yeah.
Last question, on the right.
I'll answer you later.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for our presentation.
Pleasure.
I would like to ask, how do you follow all these trends and social and technical transitions? How do you inform you to have such projects always on trends and transitions?
I would say a part of it is interest and passion. All right. I think earlier Professor Xavier talked about, and I think this is where really environment shapes your life and behavior. I grew up in the kind of 80% of, or rather the kind of landscape and setting like many of the 80% of Singaporeans are public housing. So many of these everyday scenes, the everyday setting, the sites, idea of bus stops, idea of some of these void deck centers are very close to heart and very familiar. So to me, I think that's one aspect that is already internalized. Of course, as I mentioned, as architect, one of our most fundamental role is the responsibility to our society. So I would say for us, it is again a second nature. And of course, the thing that helps is through the institute, SIA, there's also broader conversations of how not just the profession is evolving, but with different segments, agency, how the entire society is evolving, and how as professional or as part of the larger fraternity, we can continue to improve and make lives better for all. Yeah.
The last one, Anna.
Last question, sorry.
Yes, okay.
So you mentioned at the beginning that population will increase to 9 million inhabitants, 9 billion inhabitants, and you also mentioned massive urbanization. However, many countries, especially in Europe, have an architectural heritage, and regulation prevents massive skyscrapers from being built. So how would you reconcile massive urbanization with architectural inheritance?
I think this is always a kind of trade-off and dialogue that happens in every city in different degree. I would say that difficulty of discussion is in fact, I would say in Singapore, is way more difficult compared to say France or Europe because of our land scarcity. So in every inch of Singapore land, there is a kind of value and purpose, whether when you talk about from the economic, social or environmental dimension. So my own take towards it is never play the kind of, I would say, the top-down hand. Important thing is to have major conversation with stakeholders, not just talking about states, agency, but more importantly, users or community that will continue to be a part of the stakeholders to enter into that discussion of what's there that we need to keep and what's there that something that we know that we can allow it to develop. I would say that conversation is happening in Singapore, especially these past 10 years. The positive sign is, especially of course as an architect, that there's a lot of I would say interest and passion from the ground about the importance of many of these existing buildings. Because there's another dementia about urban dementia. Sometimes when cities always kind of recreate overnight, you lose track of what's really something authentic. And again, going back to public housing landscape in Singapore, I think what that came out quite functionally as a need to house the population now becomes one of the most authentic and kind of original setting of that describe a large part of Singaporeans' identity, which is our HDB flat. So there's a part that I think community, at least here, are beginning to start owning some of this fabric and memories. But I would say the decision to make is definitely not that of an architect, but it's that of the community itself, and that conversation must continue to go on. Of course, myself is championing conservation as much as we can. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.